Our house had learned how to be quiet after my mother died. Not the peaceful kind, more like the kind that presses against your ears at night, reminding you of everything that's missing. My father filled that silence with work. Long hours, short conversations, polite nods in the hallway. He loved me, I knew that. But love and presence aren't always the same thing. I was 22 and living back home, telling myself it was temporary. Telling myself a lot of things, actually. Most evenings, I ate alone. The television stayed on for noise, not entertainment. I learned the rhythms of the house, when the pipes rattled, when the floorboards creaked, when loneliness felt loudest. That was when he started coming by more often. My father's closest friend had always been around, even before everything fell apart. But after my mother's death, his visits became routine. He helped with repairs, shared coffee at the kitchen table, stayed late enough that the sun disappeared before I noticed. He talked to my father about practical things, bills, repairs, work. But when he spoke to me, his voice softened. He asked real questions, the kind that didn't end with a distracted, "That's nice. How are you holding up? What do you want to do next? Are you sleeping okay?" No one had asked me those things in months. At first, I was grateful. That's all. Gratitude is harmless, I told myself. It doesn't ask for anything. It doesn't cross lines. But gratitude has a way of lingering. One night, my father went to bed early. Another long day, another closed door. His friend stayed behind, sitting across from me at the kitchen table while the clock ticked too loudly between us. We talked about nothing important, about everything that felt heavy. The world outside the window was dark, and inside, the light felt too warm, too close. When the conversation slowed, neither of us moved right away. I noticed the way he listened, not waiting to speak, not checking the time. Just listening. I noticed the steadiness of his presence, the way it made my chest feel less tight. That's when the feeling came. Uninvited, unnamed. I didn't look at him. I was afraid that if I did, something would be written on my face that I wasn't ready to read myself. This is nothing, I told myself. You're lonely, that's all. But loneliness doesn't make your pulse quicken when someone stands up to leave. Loneliness doesn't make silence feel charged. He said goodnight. His hand brushed the back of a chair as he passed. An ordinary moment, a harmless one. Still, after he left, I sat alone in the kitchen far longer than I needed to, staring at a cup that had gone cold. Guilt arrived quietly. It didn't accuse me, yet. It only whispered that something had shifted, that a line had been noticed even if it hadn't been crossed. I promised myself I would be more careful. I promised myself distance. At the time, I still believed promises were enough. I didn't know yet how easily silence can turn into temptation, or how quickly comfort can become something dangerous. For a while, it worked, or at least I convinced myself it did. I kept my answers short when he visited. I stayed in my room longer. I found reasons to leave the house when I heard his car pull into the driveway. I told myself that awareness was the same as control. It wasn't. The house seemed to conspire against me. My father worked later hours. Nights stretched longer. And somehow, his friend's presence felt more constant, not less, woven into the fabric of our routine like he'd always belonged there. I began to notice how often he looked tired. How responsibility sat on his shoulders the same way it sat on my father's. How he never spoke badly about anyone, especially the man who trusted him most. That should have been enough to shut everything down. Instead, it made things worse. One evening, the power went out during a storm. Rain hit the roof in heavy sheets, drowning out the rest of the world. My father was still at work, unreachable. Candles flickered on the kitchen counter, turning shadows into something intimate. We sat across from each other again. Too familiar. Too easy. "This place feels heavy sometimes," he said quietly, breaking the silence. I nodded before I realized what I was agreeing to. That was the first confession, not of desire, but of truth. I told him how small I felt in that house. How my father loved me but didn't see me anymore. How grief had rearranged all of us, leaving me without a place that felt solid. He listened, always listening. When he spoke, it wasn't advice this time. It was understanding. You're not wrong for feeling that way, he said. You're allowed to want more than survival. The words settled deep inside me, dangerous in their kindness. I should have changed the subject. I should have stood up. I should have remembered every reason this was a bad idea. Instead, I asked him a question I hadn't planned. Do you ever feel lonely? He hesitated, just long enough. That pause told me everything. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was softer than before. More careful, more often than I admit. Something shifted then, not outwardly, not visibly, but inside me, a door cracked open. It wasn't desire yet, it was recognition. Two people standing too close to the same ache. We laughed after that, trying to lighten the moment. But laughter couldn't undo what had already been said. The air felt thick, like it was holding its breath. When the power came back on, the overhead lights were too bright. Reality rushed in, unwelcome and sharp. He stood up quickly, as if movement alone could restore the distance we'd lost. This doesn't have to be complicated, he said, more to himself than to me. I nodded again, too easily. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every word, every look, every silence. I told myself nothing had happened. No rules were broken, no promises shattered, but I also knew something else. We had crossed into emotional territory that didn't belong to us. And once you step into something forbidden, even without touch, it starts leaving fingerprints everywhere. I wondered who would notice first. My father, him, or me. We became experts at pretending. Conversations stayed polite when my father was around. Eye contact was brief. Laughter was measured. To anyone watching, we were exactly what we were supposed to be, a grieving family and a loyal friend holding things together. But pretense has a cost. I felt it in the way my thoughts drifted toward him when I should have been focused elsewhere. In the way my body reacted before my mind had time to intervene. I hated myself for noticing patterns, how he always arrived at the same time, how he lingered just long enough to make leaving feel abrupt. The worst part wasn't the wanting. It was the secrecy. Secrecy turned ordinary moments into loaded ones. Passing in the hallway, standing too close at the sink, sharing a look that lasted half a second longer than it should have. We never acknowledged it out loud. That made it feel both safer and more dangerous. One afternoon, my father asked me to help clear out the garage. Old boxes, dusty memories. He left halfway through to take a call, promising he'd be back soon. His friend stayed behind with me, sorting through things neither of us cared about. The space was tight. The air smelled like cardboard and oil. I laughed at something he said, too quickly, too brightly, and stopped myself when I saw his expression change. Concern, maybe, or recognition. This can't keep happening, he said quietly. I knew exactly what he meant. My heart still reacted anyway. We're not doing anything, I replied, defensive before I meant to be. He shook his head. That's not the same as being innocent. The words stung because they were true. For the first time, we spoke about it, carefully, indirectly, like naming it might make it real. He talked about loyalty, about my father's trust, about lines that exist for a reason. I listened, nodding, agreeing with everything he said. Inside, something broke anyway. Because knowing something is wrong doesn't always stop it from feeling right. That night, my father mentioned how grateful he was. How much he appreciated having someone he could rely on. He said it casually, without suspicion, and the weight of it settled on my chest like a confession I hadn't made. I couldn't sleep. Guilt kept looping through my thoughts, tangled with longing. I wondered if this was how betrayal always began, not with intention, but with weakness. The next day, his friend didn't come over. The silence felt deliberate, punishing, necessary. I told myself this was the end. That distance would reset everything. That I'd imagined the depth of it all along. Then my phone buzzed. A simple message. Neutral. Careful. Are you okay? I stared at the screen longer than I should have. My reply was just as cautious. Yeah. Just tired. That was all it took. The restraint we'd built cracked under the smallest pressure. Messages stayed innocent, but the frequency wasn't. Concern became habit. Habit became reliance. We were no longer just reacting to circumstance. We were choosing connection, and with that choice came a truth I could no longer avoid. If my father ever saw us the way we were beginning to see each other, it wouldn't matter that we hadn't crossed every line. Some lines, once blurred, can never be made invisible again. I wondered how much longer we could pretend before pretending became the real betrayal. The breaking point didn't arrive dramatically. No shouting, no slammed doors, no undeniable proof. It came quietly, like everything else had. My father started watching more closely. Not suspiciously at first, just observant. The way people become when something feels off but they don't yet know why. He noticed pauses in conversation. The way I'd leave the room when his friend arrived. The way his friend stopped staying late. Distance, I learned, can be just as revealing as closeness. One evening, my father asked me a question I wasn't prepared for. Are you happy here? It was simple, genuine, and it unraveled me. I hesitated too long enough for him to notice. I think so, I said, hating how uncertain it sounded. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me, searching. That night, I cried quietly in my room, not because I'd been caught, but because I realized how close we'd come to hurting someone who had already lost too much. The messages slowed after that. Not because we talked about stopping, but because neither of us needed to say it out loud. Silence returned, heavier than before. This time, it wasn't empty. It was full of restraint. When we finally spoke alone again, it was brief. Necessary. This can't go anywhere, he said. His voice didn't waver, but his hands did. Not without destroying something we can't rebuild. I nodded. I didn't argue. I didn't ask what if. Because I already knew the answer. We never touched. We never confessed out loud what we felt. But the loss felt real anyway. Weeks passed. Then months. Life resumed its shape. My father laughed more. The house felt lighter. His friend visited less often, and when he did, everything stayed carefully normal. Polite, appropriate, safe. And yet, every so often, our eyes met across the room, not longing anymore, but understanding. Some connections aren't meant to be acted on. They exist only to test who you are when no one is watching. I moved out not long after. New place, new routines, new silence to learn how to live with. Sometimes, late at night, I think about how close we came to changing everything without ever crossing the line. I wonder if that makes us better people, or just luckier ones. Because infidelity isn't always about bodies. Sometimes it lives entirely in the heart, leaving no evidence behind, except the knowledge that, once, you wanted something you were never meant to have. And that wanting was enough to haunt you long after you chose to walk away.